My initial introduction to the debate around the SATs was actually from my advisor at Stanford, a man named John R. Rickford. He grew up in British Guyana, incredibly poor, incredibly far from where he ended up going. He ended up at an Ivy League university. And John, when someone in a class one time said, well, the questions are racist or something like that, and John said, yes, but at least they can't move the goalposts.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Sonika Garcia.
And I'm Brad Davidson, and this is Breaking the Code,
a podcast series addressing misconceptions related to the discipline of behavioral science. We hope to arm you, our listeners, with the tools you need to make sense of behavioral science and to help you apply it to your work as communication extraordinaires. Thanks for tuning in. This is episode 30, I believe, if I remember that. Yeah. Check us out. 30 episodes. This week, we are going to cover a topic that I'm sure everyone listening in has heard the buzz around, and that is the whole debate around the SAT requirement. Just quick background, during COVID, a lot of schools went SAT optional, their admissions process, and now some of the best schools, MIT, Dartmouth, they are reinstating their SAT as a requirement. Everyone needs to submit their SAT scores.
Just to take a step back for 1 second, because not everyone who listens to this is from America. The SATs are the Scholastic Aptitude Tests. Yep. They've been given for decades. I took them and I went to college in the 80s, and they existed well before that. They're a standardized test that you used to have to take to apply to colleges and universities in America. They are scored in the most bizarre way. You have a 200 to 800 range on two halves of the test. So the lowest score you can get is 400, and the highest score you can get is a 1600 on those two scores. And people have complained about them for literally decades. People have also debated back and forth about how to make them better. And they're a very, very central part of the application and admission process in American universities, and they have become hotly contested. So, Sneak, I didn't mean to step on your lines, but I just wanted to make sure that someone in England goes, what's the SAT? It's like, we saved you the Google.
Yeah. Yes. And as someone who, as soon as I hear SAT, I immediately, even though it's been, more than 10 years, I have somewhat of an adverse reaction because
Shanika has PTSD. SAT
I
PTSD.
I do. But I think, and just to have a quick human moment, I think, when we were talking about, just the three of us within the medical anthropology team, we were talking about what do we think about it? Do we think it should be brought back? And in just having these side conversations. And, my initial reaction when I heard they rescinded the requirement is I was quote unquote up in arms about it. I was like, oh, how dare these kids not have to, go through what I went through. And just in researching and having the conversation with Brad and Gabe in preparation for this episode, it's opened my eyes to a lot of the debate. Why is it so debated? It is not black and white. And so I hope that in today's conversation, many of our listeners are able to, learn something that you didn't know before and why it's so hotly debated.
Yeah, I think the core question these days is, are the SATs helping or hurting equity?
Yeah.
And they've become a real football to be kicked around. And there's really 2 points, right? So I pulled two articles.
I think these are great quotes. And yeah, we won't blame the two sides. I think these two quotes do a great job. So I'll read them quickly if that's okay, or summarize them. So Sean Harper, who is a DE&I expert, wrote in July 2023 that removing test scores entirely from the admissions process would not only ensure that all applicants are given equal consideration, but it would also be a responsible way to redress longstanding socioeconomic disadvantages that disproportionately account for below average scores amongst applicants of color from lower income and working class families. So it basically, removing it helps create a more equitable admissions process, right? Cool. Makes sense. On the other side of the debate, the MIT Dean of Admissions, his name is Stu Schmill. Hopefully I'm saying that right. So he basically said that not having SATs or ACTs scores to consider tends to raise socioeconomic barriers to demonstrating readiness for our education. And so that dropping the SAT, as it turns out, actually would hurt low-income students rather than helping them. And so when I had read that quote and that side of the debate, I was a little taken aback. And that's where I think the research was very interesting.
Look, there's two questions in there, and this is, I'll give sort of my background on it. One is I did very well in standardized testing, so I don't have the same post-traumatic experience. I would walk into them knowing I would walk out doing really well. And in fact,
Oh,
I wouldn't
you're
have
one of
gotten
those. Just
I
kidding.
am one of those. And in fact, I would not have gotten into the college I got into with just my grades, because my grades were a hot mess. I was not a great kid. We'll just leave it there. I ended up at several high schools, but my SATs were enough to get me noticed by what's considered a fairly competitive college, right? And so they took a runner on me based on those scores, and it worked out fine for me. The question really is, can standardization of processes effectively stop subjective decision making, right? Which is open to racist or classist or sexist ruling. So, the one side of it is, well, this guy has good grades, but he's not really a Harvard man. And what they mean by that is he's, black or Jewish or whatever. Now, one of the unknown things about these tests, or well known but not really talked about, is there's two cohorts who feel like the test optional actually worked against them. Historically, there were, believe it or not, quotas against Jews at the Ivy Leagues. This is not like speculation. They talk about it. There was this belief for a long time that Jews studied harder than everyone else, and it was unfair, and that you would end up with too many Jewish people at Yale. So, for example, Yale had a quota. They really did. You can look it up. Now, the people who brought the ruling or brought the court case against racially based admissions were Asian students who said, we come from a culture where studying for tests is a big part of what we do. And that's being discounted. And they're basically doing de facto quotas against us, that just based on the scores, we should be more represented than we are, right? So the second question here is, are the SATs equitable? And do they serve to reinforce, unequitable admissions practices? And I think those two questions, we're really going to talk about the second one a lot more today, because the larger question of standardization gets into things like, can you make a racist system less racist by putting rules in? And generally the answer is it's hard, because they get applied in bad faith. You look at things like mandatory sentencing. It was supposed to take the variability out. Instead, it became a cudgel to put black men away for life for small crimes in the 80s. So, all right, but let's start with the second one, right? The SATs, pretty well-studied history. They come out of, just quick background, World War II. All of the tests that sort of social scientists created to place all eligible American men who were being drafted very quickly. Should you be a soldier? Should you be a draftsman? Should you be a pilot? Should you be a navigator? Those tests that we take in high school in America that tell you should go be a veterinary scientist or something, they come out of that, right? And the SATs come out of this. They're Scholastic Aptitude Tests, meaning they test a body of knowledge, and they attest your ability to certain degrees. And so that knowledge is standardized. There's a core body of knowledge, and this is not unique to America. The Confucian tradition in China believes strongly that there's a body of knowledge to know, and if you know it, then you should be rewarded with a certain type of job or something like that, right? Now, it turns out the SATs are a very good predictor of success in college. They're the best one we have, actually. Better than your grades, better than your recommendations is your SATs. So that begs the question, as Sean Harper, who we quoted before, and it's an article we found. We don't know Sean, but he articulates very clearly a very clear position. He goes, the SATs are not IQ tests. He's correct. They are not. The SAT and ACT, for those of you who don't know, the ACT is a sort of substitute for the SAT, but it's essentially the same thing, right? The SAT and the ACT have been shown to be highly correlated with undergrad students' freshman year grade point averages. They're also highly correlated with their graduation rates. Yet there are so many other far more competitive compelling factors that also reliably determine first-year academic performance grades in subsequent years and bachelor degree completion rates. That's not true. In fact, Sean doesn't provide any of those indicators because as far as I can tell, there aren't any. So I invite anybody who knows that. I'm open to being wrong here. But one of the complaints about the test is that it's a poor reflection of people's abilities. It's not. It's a very accurate reflection of what is essentially what I keep calling an apartheid education system. That you don't do well on the SATs if you come out of a poor school district, largely because we have undereducated you. So the tests are accurate. It's that they're accurate in recording the results of unequal education. And that is something that you can't blame the test for. You can only blame the educational system for it. So that's one piece to put out there, that removing the SATs doesn't actually remove the unequal education that we provide to people who are in poorer neighborhoods or who are of color. It simply removes the ability to point it out. But the other thing, and I think it's probably more compelling, and then I'll sort of stop here and I'll let Sanika go, but this, give me a little runway on this. My initial introduction to the debate around the SATs was actually from my advisor at Stanford, a man named John R. Rickford, a great linguist. He's an emeritus now, but he grew up in British Guyana, incredibly, incredibly poor, incredibly far from where he ended up going. He ended up at an Ivy League university. And John, when someone in a class one time said, well, the questions are racist or something like that, and John said, yes, but at least they can't move the goalposts. And for someone who was coming up through the civil rights era, like John was, the SATs were something that you could study. Maybe it was harder to study them. Maybe it was, you were at a disadvantage. You were starting at the minus 20-yard line of the 100-yard dash. But John's point was they couldn't look at you and go, that 1,500 or that 1,600 that you got, that's not valid. Because I don't know your school. I don't know the person who wrote the recommendation, but this kid from Choate Rosemary Hall, I know their advisor. John was basically saying, the only way that someone who comes from a background like me could possibly get ahead would be to take a standardized test that they can't move on me. And in talking to Gabe, and I don't want to speak for Gabe, but we were talking about this, and Gabe basically said, yeah, it's a chance to stand out. A lot of what gets written about the admissions process in America has to do with wealthy children get opportunities to put things on their resumes that poor children don't. So wealthy children get to do a semester abroad, or they get to do, I went to France for 2 months and learned French, and poor children have to work or don't get those opportunities. And so the resumes don't look as good. And that's exactly what Stu Schmidt was saying from MIT, that if you just leave it to a curated resume, the wealthy kids have a curated resume. And so, as Gabe put it, it's a chance to stand out. If you kill the SATs, no matter where you come from, that is going to get you noticed. Now, is everybody going to kill the SATs? No. Am I saying they're not racist or inequitable? No. But I will quote the New York Times in saying it's the least racist measuring stick we have at the moment. So let that sink in. We're not saying they're not racist. They're the least racist measuring stick we have, and they're the least classist measuring stick we have. So I've always been a fan of them. I know that they're flawed. I know that they cause a lot of stress and anxiety, but they are the only objective, I'm looking for a better word, but truly objective measure of like for like, and that I think is very valuable. And I do think having removed them, we've removed the one thing that compares everybody on a relatively level playing field. So that was my point of view coming into this. Again, I'm well aware that not everybody shares that point of view, but it is a point of view, and it is fairly data driven. Not that they should be the only thing, far from it, but they are a chance for people who have no other chance to get noticed by an MIT or a Penn or something like that. So I know I've gone on for a bit of a while.
I'm starting to see a different side. I do think that they are a chance for people to stand out. I think, chatting with Gabe, who's obviously much closer to have taken the SATs and we are, and so yes, just even stating that point, I see that. Can't deny the other side of the debate, which is that these tests are seen as inequitable by a large group, and I'm sure by some of the, not just, people on the left or progressives, but also by the students who this affects. And so just digging into that a little bit, why are the tests seen as inequitable?
So I think there's a couple of reasons. One is, for one, you look at the scores, and Black and brown students in aggregate do not as well as their counterparts who are white and Asian. Again, I don't know if that means the test is racist or if that's actually capturing that we have a very, very unfair educational system that undereducates many people. Yeah,
I would
I
argue
too.
mostly the latter. Yeah.
Mostly the latter. And actually, there is some proof there because the largest government run education system is the Department of Defense education activity system, which is the one that if your parents are in the military, you go to school on military bases, and it's the DODEA that educates you. And famously, the military is very diverse. It is majority minority these days. And that school system famously is one of the ones where race is not a good predictor of your SAT scores. So it's got to do with things like full employment of the parents. It's got to do with things like oversight of the children. So if you act up in class, you may get a call from your commanding officer saying your child just messed up in class, get your kid under control kind of thing. Like there's a lot of reasons why the DODEA students do quite well, but I will say anecdotally, many of the students of color that I was at Stanford with doing graduate work were military brats, had grown up in the DODEA. And so that sort of, is the military itself a sort of non-racial institution? That's a different discussion, but it sort of proves that it's much more to do with the education you're given than anything inherent about you as a human, right? So there are questions that people identified as racist. They're the minority of questions. The math questions aren't particularly racist. They really are a reflection of, have you been taught good study habits, and can you learn difficult subject matter, and can you write? All of those come out of, for example, what your class student teacher ratio is. How much money is in the school library? Do you have enrichment? Do you have the opportunity to do extracurriculars? Those sorts of things really matter. And so when you look closely at the SAT scores, rural white students don't do very well either in West Virginia. It's really a reflection of poor educational systems, essentially educational apartheid, right? So I think the idea that they're inherently racist it may be true, but it's not the larger reason why students don't do well on them, nor is it the larger reason why it's a good predictor. It's a good predictor of your capabilities in college because it's designed to predict, can you handle college type work? Doesn't mean you're dumb, doesn't mean you're not a good person or creative in other ways. It is a very specific set of tests that is a measurement of your ability to study and handle complex concepts. If you haven't been trained how to do that, you're not going to do very well on the test, but that's not your fault. They didn't train you. So to me, they're a very accurate reflection of what is a very broken educational system, a 2 or even 3-tiered system in America. They're considered racist because you can see race play out in them, but that to me doesn't make them racist. That makes them accurate, if that makes sense.
It makes sense. I wonder, a question that I still think of though is like, yes, the SAT may be a good predictor of how well, I don't know. I think that doing well on the SATs can show that you are going to probably do well in college. But I don't necessarily think that like, yes, maybe a poor score, but I don't think that like an average score is any indication that you potentially are not going to do well and like
Right.
excel in college. And I think that's where some of these other sort of environmental factors come into play.
Yeah.
But I'm going to pause right here because we have Gabe on. Gabe's always on our episodes. And so I want to give him a chance.
One of the things that's been sticking out to me, you two have been discussing about the SAT being a predictor of college success. And I feel like that term is such a broad term because if you take, even Brad, with your story of John Rickford, he gets a really high score in his SATs and he goes to a great college. Excelling in that environment for different people will look differently. I feel like the SAT, and I just want to make sure this is clarified here, is like a predictor of academic success in school.
Correct.
Not like social, cultural, I'm going to fit in. People are going to be racist towards me. I'm not going to feel imposter syndrome, left out. I just want to make sure that point is crystal clear.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, look, I have a feeling there's people shouting or have already hung up, but there's probably people shouting at their radios or whatever they listen to now. So what Gabe said, let me triple down on that, right? There are very, 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 very clear data that people who come, say, first-time university students who don't come from a background where their parents or their siblings went to university, they have a very hard time because university is not just about academic achievement. It's about a lot of other things. And there is a sort of socioeconomic class structure to college. I think community colleges are much more attuned to people, say, getting out of the military, single moms who are returning to the workforce. They're much more attuned to giving people practical educational sort of opportunities, and they're much more attuned to the difficulties people might have. And these elite universities that we're talking about, they're out of touch with a lot of stuff, right? And the completion rate, say, of Native Americans, even when there's outreach for them, is quite low, and it's got to do with a lot more outside of school than it does with the actual ability to handle material that they're teaching you in a class, right? So let's stipulate that. I think the other thing that I don't want to overstate is the tests are not non-skewed, right? If you grow up being trained on the test, you're going to score better. We didn't say they're not racist. We didn't say they're not, we didn't say they're perfect. We said they're the least racist tool we have to measure. And John's point was not that it's fair. John actually said, I might have to work 10 times harder than someone else to get the same score. His point, they can't change that on you. And if you're willing to put the work in, right? So his point was the world is unfair. This is the fairest opportunity I'm going to have. But that's recognizing that the system itself is built in a way that's unfair. And you have to stipulate that first. The other thing is, I think people should recognize that the idea that studying for the SATs is why people do better, only a little. You can bump your scores by 50 to 100 points fairly easily, and then it gets very, very, very hard to keep going up unless you actually learn new stuff. If you don't learn spherical trigonometry, you cannot get an 800 on the SAT math section. You cannot take strategy your way through spherical trigonometry. You just got to learn it. And so, I think there are unquestionably elements to this that favor the privileged. But they favor them less than looking at their resume going, well, why didn't you go to France? Because I was working.
Yeah. And I think one of the things, and we've tried to strategize some ways to make it, even with the requirement, how you can make it a little more equitable. I think one of them is the whole super scoring or being able to take it 50,000 times. I know, Brad, you had mentioned that back when you were taking the SATs, you maybe took it once, maybe twice.
Yes.
3 times was very rare.
3 times didn't do you any good because, so back when I took it, all the way up till 2012, your scores were reported to college. And the number of times you took the test was reported to college. And so we were all told, and I do come from the privileged background where college was assumed, and people sort of, everybody's parents knew the game around the SATs. You knew that you couldn't take them more than twice without it being a mark against you. And if you took it once and it was good enough, you didn't take it a second time. People would take it once, they would take it a second time, and that's it. What they've done is they figured out a way of making more money. And so you can now take it as many times as you want. It's $60 a throw. And like I said in the beginning, there's 2 halves to it. And so you can super score it. You can take the best 2 halves and put them together into your best score. Well, that obviously favors the rich because to take the test 5 times costs you $300 and it costs you 3 full Saturdays. So, to me, that's the first real just throwing their hands up and going let's just hand it to the rich, because that is anathema to the idea that it's an equalizer. The more shots on goal you take, the higher your score is going to be. So I think that's the first thing they've got to do. If they're going to go back to using this test, they can't let people super score it. It is completely anathema to the idea that this is somehow an accurate and fair representation, at least approximation of people's ability. To me, that's the number one thing. Go back to making it not something you can just buy your best score through repetition.
I think the first lowest hanging fruit on improving this stuff.
I think one other thing to think about, right? Gabe mentioned it. It's a predictor of success. You got to understand from a university standpoint, they know that of the people who apply to the university, far more people could do the work than they're going to let in. And it's a game that they're going through. So forget Harvard. Most people don't apply to Harvard. Most people don't get into Harvard, and people talk about like the Ivies as if they were representative. They're not. A minuscule fraction of people go to Ivies. It's much better to look at something like a flagship state school where many, many more people go, right? So looking at SUNY Binghamton, which is the flagship New York SUNY school. There's 23 SUNY schools. It was set up as the Research One institution. We're switching that now. Now it'll be Buffalo and I think Stony Brook as well. But for now, it's still just Binghamton. They got 40,000 applications for less than 2,000 spots. Of those 40,000, I'm just going to guess, 20,000 kids could probably do the work. So that means 18,000 students have to be told no who could have done the work. And that's the problem. It's not obvious how you then select the 2,000 out of the 20,000. And the 20,000 I'm making up. 40,000 is a real number, right? 2,000 is a real number. I think it's 1,800. Somewhere between a very large number of students who could do the work and the students who get in is the process of acceptance. And that's the one that people are talking about being inequitable. And that I agree with. That we have to work on to be much more thoughtful about looking at people's backgrounds, being able to make like for like comparisons. But this is why I am in favor of the SATs, because I do think they at least give you a yardstick. Should they be the only thing? Absolutely not. But they do give you a yardstick, right? So that's to me, that's one thing. And as just because you didn't get into school doesn't mean you wouldn't have succeeded. It just means you didn't get in. It's a very weird lottery. So anyway, I'm sorry. I took the low hanging fruit from you because it's like that's the one that really pissed me off when I didn't realize it till my kids started taking them, that you could take it multiple times. That before I even looked into it, I was like, that's just wrong. Like that absolutely favors the rich. So that's the number one thing in my mind, right? We have 4 other strategies that we put down that we think would be at least step towards making it more equitable. They're not comprehensive, but another one would be if they are how you get to college, then train everyone on the test, right? The basic test improvements have to do with testing strategies. They're not that hard to teach. If you're going to make it mandatory to get into college that you have to take the SATs, make it mandatory that you do some SAT prep in school. Very quickly, you see return on investment in terms of like 50 to 75 point bumps, right? Just learning how to take the test. Make it free, right? Subsidize it. Shouldn't have to be like, do I don't know, buy my bus pass or take the SATs this month? $60 is not trivial. It's an expensive test. And when you start looking at the application fees and the SAT fees and then the AP fees and all the other tests you can take, they start to add up in a very significant way very quickly. Trust me, my daughter's applying to college. Make sure the test is just one piece of a larger puzzle. I think everyone agrees with that. When you just look at the test scores, you've missed out on who this person is. So just because it's a good like for like yardstick, it doesn't do a very good job, doesn't do any job whatsoever in telling what somebody had to overcome, where they come from, what their potential is, what their capacity is as a person for all of those other things that Gabe talked about, that, fitting in or doing something with your life, right? And I think the last one, I, again, may get hate mail for this, but I think we should make it mandatory. I think this whole optional thing has caused tremendous stress and anxiety. I think people don't understand when to send in their scores and when not to send in their scores, and I think it's hurting people. I think it's really not okay to say just send them in if you do great, because one thing that will happen is year over year, the average scores will go up, because nobody wants to submit scores that are below average. And so year over year, it's going to look like you need a 1,500 to get into, SUNY Binghamton, which is not true. So for all the reasons that a standardized anything doesn't work unless you make it mandatory, we should probably make this mandatory to get into college. That's my 2 cents, but we should also train people and make it free. I think Sanika has some larger points she wants to make. I just want to say, because this is the last thing I will say on this podcast, these are obviously very contentious issues and they're very important and they've been front and center. College is seen as the great upward mobility engine in the United States. And making sure that college and college attendance is equitable is not a theoretical discussion. It's a very real, practical, important discussion. I am open to the idea that I have the SATs completely wrong. I would just need data to prove it, right? Because so far, the data that I've seen prove that they're, in fact, one of the ways that you can get into an elite college without having an elite background, quote, air quotes, right? Like money wise. So that's my last thing. There are definitely strategies to make it less inequitable, but it's still more equitable than just, well, who did more stuff? So, but Sanika,
Yeah.
over to you to sort of take it home.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are all really fair points. I think the like test optional, like, and we can get into whole like behavioral science deep dive into like why having anything be optional with some people doing it and some people aren't, especially when like you're being like assessed. I think that not only causes anxiety, but it doesn't really make any sense. I mean, it makes some sense, but not entirely. So if it's going to be a requirement, great. Otherwise, don't accept it at all. Let it not even be a thing. But then there's issues with that. So all to say, I think taking a step back, this conversation has been really interesting. This research has been really interesting. I'm still not 100% sure where I stand, but that's also just part of my nature. I'm always just kind of like trying to learn more and see more. But like, yes, to your point, Brad, the data is very important. I think data quality is a big takeaway here. I think just in the research alone and the podcast that we listened to in preparation for this episode and the research, data just is being thrown around. Like 85-90% of people, think the SAT should be a requirement. This is across all, racial groups. And I just think that when it comes to data, a lot of times we just see numbers and we're like, oh, well, then this just must be it. And really digging into, who actually makes up, who are the people that make up that data point, and what was even things like, how did they self-select to be in this survey, particularly like survey methodology, I think is a really important thing. So when we're doing research, and we have to do a lot of research in our field, we're tasked with our clients to create a lot of times like equity programs and to do equity-based research. I think really questioning data is an important like first step, and something we should always keep in mind. I also think that we have to make sure, and I know I've made this point plenty of times, but just making sure that we are turning to the communities and really co-creating, turning to the communities that we aim to serve when we think to create solutions. Oftentimes, we find ourselves speaking at or about certain groups instead of to them. And I think not saying that like, we should go and speak to every single high school student who lives in a low income area and have them pick what the solution is. No, but I think taking their consideration is important, and there should be a sophisticated way for our policies, I think, in this country largely to do that. So not to like be on a soapbox, but yeah.
No, but look, I think, one of the things that you've said, I said I wouldn't say anything more and that never happens. So I think one of the things you said that I always found really interesting when I was at an elite, R1, as they call it, Research One University, was huge diversity outreach initiatives brought loads of students who might not have gotten there otherwise in, and then many of them left. And I started asking myself, what was the purpose of bringing them here? Was it to turn them into us, or was it so that we could listen to their sort of point of view and have them change the institution by their presence? And it was very clearly the former, not the latter, right? Like the idea was, we'll bring you in from the Navajo reservation, or we'll bring you in from, rural Appalachia, or we'll bring you in from inner city, Baltimore, so that you can become us. And I thought that was not the right way of approaching it, that if we're really going to be a pluralistic society, you have to be amenable to the idea that you're going to change based on the perspectives of people that you've brought in. Otherwise, it is just like pointless,
Yeah, and to sit there and say like, and to Gabe's earlier point that, clearly it's only a predictor of academic success within a university. It's like, if we're looking at success holistically, it's not enough to just say like this SAT will tell us how you're going to do at our university. Well, if that's showing you that they're not going to do well, then maybe we need to rethink what's the measure of doing well and how can we reconsider that.
That's a really good point. Can you start looking at like, and again, I don't want to shoot from the hip, but I was going to say something like, if you have, good transcripts and relatively low scores, but maybe you go into the freshman writing class and it was like, oh yeah, they have a freshman writing class, right? Like I think there's a lot to this, and I think it has become a complete political football how universities let people in. Some of it because people believe that like going to Harvard is a ticket for life. It doesn't hurt, but it's not a ticket for life. And I will say this. I've said this many, many times to people, but I will end on this. I went to Stanford to do a PhD, and it was a fairly small cohort. And yes, we had people from Brandeis, and I went to Tufts, and someone went to Yale. These are expensive, elite, small, private institutions. But fully half of my cohort came out of places like SUNY Buffalo, the University of New Mexico, et cetera, right? Large public state schools are a fantastic education, provided, you find the right sort of niche and the rest of it. I think what people have to focus on is there's only so many people who can go to an Ivy League school anyway. There's only so many slots. It's not death if you don't go there. You just, get the best education you can no matter where you go. Does it help to have an Ivy League imprimatur? Yes. Is it a guarantee that nothing bad will ever happen to you? Fantastically, absolutely not. So first of all of you who are waiting to get into schools in the next couple months, like it's not a referendum on who you are. It's just a lottery. And second, it's part of a much bigger picture of mobility and equity in the country. I think focusing on the SATs is actually a red herring. They're not responsible for a poor educational system. They are reflections of a poor educational system.
With that, let's wrap up because I think we could keep on going. So
it touches on everything, right? So I'm Brad Davidson.
I'm Sanika Garcia.
And I'm Gabriel Allen Cummings. And this was Breaking the Code.
Woo! Yes. Until next time. Thanks,
Until next
everyone.
time, guys. Bye.
Breaking the Code is a podcast created and produced by Havas Health and Use Medical Anthropology Department. Hosted by Brad Davidson and Sanika Garcia. Content and post-production audio editing done by Gabriel Allen Cummings. And inspiration from all of you. Thank you for listening and for your continued support. If you enjoy these episodes, we would love to hear from you. Please leave a rating, subscribe, and send us a message to our mailbox at medicalanthropology@havas.com. Until next time.